Here it is finally, the project I'm most proud of, a project that made me use almost every trick up my sleeve. An accurate replica of the Pokeball from Legends Arceus, with smoke and all. I started by considering how the item is crafted in-game. To make one, you need an apricorn and a tumbustone. Based on this, I had to assume that the wooden half is related to the apricorn and the upper part must be tumbustone. Meanwhile, it's pretty clear that the two tails are made out of some kind of metal, so I settled upon wood for the bottom half, tin for the metal, and terracotta for the upper part. This idea alone was the one thing that made me stubborn about completing the project. It's close enough to some kind of stone, and the color seems pretty much spot on if compared to the artwork. It's as close to a perfect fit as it could be. The dimensions were not set in stone. The heights of the Pokémons wasn't consistent enough to figure out how big other items should be, so I had to make an educated guess. Pixel measurements were inaccurate due to perspective. I could see the diameter ranging from 6 to 14 cm. A standard Pokeball seems to be around 6 to 7 cm in diameter, even though judging from how big it looks in the protagonist's hand, I'd say this ancient version is a bit bigger. To settle this argument, I decided to take a look at the materials I could gather, and I found some really convenient wood spheres with an 8 cm diameter that were convincing enough, so I bought those. Then, to get a proportion, this time I decided to import the official artwork of the item and make a 3D model in Blender, matching the dimensions from the same point of view. So, I got this fantastic wooden sphere. To cut it, I've attempted pretty much everything. A combination of a Dremel, handsaw, wedging, blood, swearing made the trick. I won't go into details. The reason is that probably any other method you can think of will be either better or at least equal. After that, I carved a big chunk of the inside, making a bit of space for the electronics that it will later roast. I got this terracotta-like clay. I played a fair bit with this stuff when I was younger, but my negative artistic skills made me unable to get decent shapes. This time though, I have a 3D printer that can help out. So I made a 3-part mold. I stuck a good amount of clay in it and waited for it to dry. Unfortunately, this did not get me a perfect result. To fix it, I had to add some really wet clay, filling in all the cracks and imperfections. At the end, I had to sand it down quite a bit to get it consistent and better mark the flat part corresponding to the front. You might be wondering how I managed to make metal parts with limited tools. Well, to make them, I first cut the shape that I needed into 3mm plywood. Then I slowly melted a lot of solder into the makeshift molds with my soldering iron. Now, is this a good process? I am not really sure about that. What I know for sure is that I managed to break a couple of tips. In total, I had to make 5 molds. One for the outer ring, 3 for the middle piece, 1 for the top piece. After casting each one, I had to sand down the parts. That took me a really long time. For the metal parts assembly, first of all, I had to tackle a daunting problem, the hinge. I decided to install in the 2 external rings a little brass hinge, because brass bonds well with salt. This was quite the distressing process, because exaggerating with the heat might melt the 2 rings together, ruining quite a lot of work, but somehow I did it. Then I added the 2 little outer rings to the front decoration. This was even worse than before, because the part to which I was soldering was even smaller, thus easier to melt and ruin. To complete it, I needed to replicate the front part. First of all, I made 2 little semicircles that I have painted silver, and to which I attached tin foil. They will serve to mask the back of this centerpiece. To connect them, I used some glue. Before mounting the inner piece to the centerpiece, I had to drill a little hole in both the main part and in the little zip-like thing. Then, as a pivot, I used a small brass nail of the same diameter as the hole. Then, after mounting everything together, I soldered them in place. Before doing this, you should file the parts so that they fit together correctly. I also made a couple of rigs to polish up the pieces. Now, the upper part is composed of 2 similar parts stuck together and soldered. Then I reshaped the upper part to be more similar to the original. I made sure to make a hole big enough to fit an ultrasonic mist maker in it. Now, to fit everything together, first I attached the metal outer rings, making sure the centerpiece was aligned. To make the little details of the centerpiece, I've used some really small iron spheres made for ball bearings. It was quite a pain to glue, but I somehow did it. I then stained the lower half and added a special finishing product made by the same company of the clay to recreate something like a glazed finish, giving it a shiny look. This coating is also important to make it waterproof for the final effect. Be careful if you work with this stuff. At the first application, I got a pretty cool effect, but it needed a solid color, so I had to remove it and sand the part with a finer grit. Let's talk about the electronics. At the start, I was much more ambitious, and the circuit was like this. It used a tilt-shaken switch. This little component contains two contacts and a ball. Based on the angle, gravity will pull the ball to the contacts and close the circuit. Shaking the Pokeball closes the switch for a short period, charging up the capacitor, which is kinda like a small battery. This capacitor will be connected to the base of a transistor that will allow current to flow from the battery to the circuit. Now, the capacitor would probably keep the transistor on for quite some time. To limit that, I've added a resistance across the two contacts of the capacitor to discharge it faster. The whole project is based on this little 16mm mist maker. It uses a fast vibrating plate that excites the water molecules, making them airborne. To feed it water, I use a sponge in close contact with the back of the module. But in the end, the board I got was not compatible with it, and the project was already taking too much time. So I just mounted it all in blindly. The board itself has a latch switch, so that I just need to press a button to turn it on. A bit boring, but more fitting for a showpiece like this. Now, to implement it into the item itself, I first created a little 3D printed chimney that will pass through the upper half. This also lets me fit everything together before mounting it into the part itself. So I fit the 16mm ultrasonic mist maker into the metal part and glued it with the 3D printed tube, while carefully routing the cables and also extending them a bit. The upper metal part is actually taller than what should stick out, but it will work as intended. This is because to blend it in, I made a hole in the upper part and resealed it with clay, also fixing into place the metal part. And after connecting all together to a battery, here it is working finally. And after almost burning out and giving up, I actually did it, without settling for a lesser version or breaking everything. I actually wanted to give this item away too, even though it is unique. While building it though, I realized that it could be a bit too fragile to give away. I am not sure about it, but I wouldn't test it. Just for the sake of it, I'll say that this item was meant to go to Sidonia. Yes, another Italian creator, call me biased. Why him? He actually gives to the Pokemon world the best coverage amongst both the national and international community. His theories about the new games and lore are just top notch. I hope you enjoyed this showcase, and I'd like to hear what item you would like me to make next.